Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out to beautiful downtown Burlington. Tonight, Phoenix Books in Burlington is proud to have Michael Nethercott here. This is his first book. It's called Séance Society. Michael's also going to be doing some telling of scary tales, ghost tales, if I understand, and singing, which is really fun. So please welcome Michael Nethercott.
Okay. I usually don't mention the singing part because I like to just spring it on people because I am not classically trained, I'll tell you that much. Anyway, thank you for being here. Thanks so much. I will talk about my book a bit, but I'm going to lead in with some tales of a supernatural nature. The book, The Seance Society, is I would call it a traditional mystery, somewhat of the golden age of mysteries, in the 30s, 40s. Yeah, think Agatha Christie, Rex Stout, Dorothy Sayers, people of that nature. And it's very much a whodunit. There's a bunch of characters. There's everything you'd want with a whodunit. And I have two detectives who I'll talk about a little bit more, Mr. O'Neill and Lee Plunkett. And this mystery deals with death among a group of spiritualists, of ghost seekers. And it's set in the 1950s. So that's the structure of it. And because it is, it's a fair mystery in that the culprit is a flesh and blood culprit, but there are supernatural underpinnings, if you will. So again, the spirit of that, get it? The spirit of that? Yeah, I wrote that joke. Because that's what I do. I'm Irish, a couple generations back, and there's definitely, Mr. O'Neill is very much an Irish detective, so there's that going on, and hence this piece. I was walking home one evening, all on a country lane. I'd been visiting the Sweeneys for to court their eldest Jane, when I there in the moonlight did my second cousin see, and cheerfully did hail him, glad for the company. I said, now, Danny Murphy, what has brought you out this way, where the only girl worth courting I myself have sparked today? I waited for an answer, I waited for a smile, but all he said was, Michael, 'tis such a lonesome mile. No, you can't deny it, Michael, 'tis such a lonesome mile. Why lonesome, Dan, I asked him, aren't we walking side by side? As homeward we do amble, I will match you stride for stride. It is homeward for you, Michael, but nevermore for me. Because of Tim Burke's workhorse, my folks I'll no more see. You know that horse, said Daniel, no man can guess its whim. I was working in the field today to lend a hand to Tim, and I did not hear his warning, no, I did not hear him shout, when that horse reared up, stove in my skull, and spilt my poor life out. Alas, it's true, I swear to you, my young life it has spilt out. I looked hard now at Daniel, and I saw his face shone gray as midnight mist, and oh, his eyes were staring far away. I'll walk with you, I said to him, aye, cousin, do not fear. I'll walk with you and see you home, by all the saints I swear. And so we journeyed down the road until we'd reached our town. And there he faded from my sight, but just before he'd gone, he turned to me and nodded with the whisper of a smile and said, thank ye for the company. 'Twas not such a lonesome mile. Oh, you led me home, my cousin. 'Twas not such a lonesome mile. And that's all the song you got tonight, so that's it for that. Here's another tale. This is also by an Irish writer of the 19th century, James Fitz O'Brien. Interesting name, James/Fitz O'Brien. Imagine a long, narrow meadow, and across it comes a single horse, astride it 2 riders. a young man in front and clinging to his back, his new bride. Right ahead of them is an old tree. It's gnarled and black and twisted, an old oak, and in years past it had served as a hanging tree for executions, and the night is pressing in on them. There was no west, there was no east, no star abroad for eyes to see, and Norman spurred his jaded beast hard by the terrible gallows tree. "Oh, Norman, haste across this waste, for something seems to follow me." "Cheer up, dear Maud, for thanked be God, we near are past the gallows tree." He kissed her lip, then spur and whip, and fast they fled across the lea, but vain the heel and rowel steel, for something leaped from the gallows tree. "Give me your cloak, your knightly cloak, that wrapped ye oft across the sea. The wind is bold, my bones are old, and I am cold on the gallows tree." "O holy God, O dearest Maud, quick, quick, some prayers, the best that be. A bony hand my neck has spanned, and tears my knightly cloak from me." "Give me your wine, the red, red wine that in a flask hangs by your knee. 10 summers burst on me accursed, and I'm athirst on the gallows tree." "O Maud, my life, my loving wife, have you no prayers to set us free? My belt unclasps, a demon grasps, and tears my wine flask from my knee." "Give me your bride, your bonny bride, who left her nest with you to flee. Oh, she has flown to be my own, for I'm alone on the gallows tree." "Cling closer, Maud, and trust in God. Cling close. Ah, heaven, she slips from me." A prayer, a groan, and he alone rode on that night from the gallows tree. My wife hates the ending of that of that poem. She said, "Wait a minute, what's it with the guy? He left his bride there and just wrote it." And I said, I wouldn't do that, but the guy. So I can't speak for Norman. Continuing on with ghost stories, I'm going to switch gears a little. I'm going to tell you some presumably true ghost stories. Now, I'm Irish on both sides, but on my mother's side, her parents were off the boat from County Kerry. And growing up, and I got a million uncles and aunts, and I think I counted 24 first cousins I have from both sides. So a big, sprawling family. And growing up, I would always hear these tales of weird things that had happened to members of the family. And I didn't really hear the full-blown versions till I was at least in my 20s, because when we were kids, they kind of, didn't let us get too overwhelmed by these tales. Now, you can believe as you choose from them, but these are the stories that were passed on. I've double-checked with different family members, and there's always variations, but these same stories have been passed down. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, so my mother's mom, so they were born in County Kerry in the late 1800s, and right after the Second World War, their oldest son, Pat, he came home from the war, and on his GI Bill, he was able to buy a house for his parents, and all 7 kids initially lived there. And when my grandmother first moved in with the kids, apparently she told them all, "If you see a little girl who's standing on the stairs or in the hallway, she's dressed in old-fashioned clothes, but don't speak to her because she's no longer living." And I was just talking with an aunt of mine, and she said that apparently my grandmother saw this little girl several times, and I just heard this, that once she saw her in the mirror. You don't want to be seeing ghosts in a mirror. I'm pretty sure of that. So these kind of tales started. There was also supposedly a line in the basement that if you crossed, you could see the dead. Is there? I don't know, but I was talking with a cousin recently, and we both felt like there was something about that basement that we never quite were comfortable with. And there was a certain section, it was a pretty extensive basement, but there was a certain section in the back that whenever we walked in, we definitely got the creeps. So is this evidence? Not necessarily, but these just tales piled on tales. My grandmother used to read tea leaves. Is anyone familiar with that, the reading of tea leaves? And usually it's, you drink it, and then you drink the tea, and then you look at whatever the formation of tea is at the bottom. And I guess there was something about swirling it 3 times. There was some sort of ritual involved. And during the Depression, people used to come over to visit my grandmother, probably a lot of people from the old country as well. And she was, she had 7 kids, not a lot of money, so people would come over as a gift, bring some cheese or bread or whatever. And in exchange, she would read the tea leaves for them. And I guess she did it quite extensively, but it stopped because a neighbor came to her and had her read the tea leaves. And the way I heard it described, it was a little like in the movies where someone goes to a fortune teller and they say, "What do you see?" And the fortune teller goes, "Oh, nothing, I see nothing, nothing at all." One of those deals. And apparently she looked, my grandmother looked into the teacup, saw that something unfortunate was going to befell the woman's son, specifically the son. And so she just, vaguely responded that she wasn't sure what she interpreted and left it at that. And then 2 weeks later, the boy died in a car accident. And after that experience, my grandmother stopped reading the tea leaves. At least, maybe she did it for herself, but she stopped doing it for people who came to see because she was so jarred by that experience. So we 7 kids, very Irish family. My Aunt Kathleen. Kathleen, she was born in 1934. She's about half the siblings have passed, but she's still alive. I saw her up in Buffalo last week. She was born with the caul. Does anyone know what the caul is? C-A-U-L? And what is it? Yeah, a flesh membrane is over the face. And it's usually not anything of great concern, and you can just brush it aside, or the doctor or nurse can. Now, the story goes that when Aunt Kathleen was born, the nurse looked at her and fainted dead away because she thought it was a faceless baby. In Ireland, at least, in other countries, it's believed that if you're born with the caul, you have the second sight, the gift, meaning you can see spirits or have dreams of premonition or any other paranormal variations of that. And a lot of the tales in my family have to do with Aunt Kathleen. For example, in the early 60s, she was up visiting her mother-in-law in Buffalo. At the time, she lived back near Portchester, New York, where I grew up. And her father was back there, living there, and most of her siblings. And anyway, she was sleeping there up in Buffalo, and she woke up, and it was about 3 in the morning, she said, and it was one of those half-dream states where you're not fully awake, but you're not fully asleep either. You're just kind of hovering. And she said she looked to the corner of the room, and there was standing my grandfather, who was back in New York, or Portchester, New York. And the odd thing was at the time, he was, I think, 63, 64 years old. But as he stood there, first of all, he shouldn't have been standing there, but the other odd thing was that he looked to be about half his age. He looked to be a man in his 30s. And he gave her a little wave, and he just said, I'm here to say goodbye. And then he was no longer there. And then a minute later, the phone rang, and it was her husband, and he was saying, of course, that my grandfather had just died. So these are the kind of tales that came rolling into me when I was a kid and would hear a lot of these things happening. And that definitely kind of leaked into my writing, if you will, and became part of how I approach stories. With the Séance Society, as I say, it's a tale about a group of ghost seekers, and murder comes to their midst. And a little bit about Mr. O'Neilan and Lee Plunkett. Mr. O'Neilan, Lee, I'll say Lee first. Lee is about 30. He is a second-generation private eye. And his father before him was a real rough-and-tumble ex-cop, tough guy, could deduct clues, but also was good with his fists. Just a tough character. Lee is none of that. He's a pretty genteel fellow, and he has none of the skill set that his father had. So in order to tackle these cases, he employs Mr. O'Neilan. Mr. O'Neilan is in his 60s. He's an Irishman who now lives in Connecticut. And Mr. O'Neilan has a long string of professions. He had been an actor. He had been a train man, a conductor, which my grandfather was. He'd been a bricklayer. He'd been, what else? He'd been a teacher. And he's very erudite. He loves to quote William Butler Yeats and Shakespeare and all the great literature. So he's a very different kind of creature than Lee is. And Mr. O'Neilan sees each case as a knightly quest, that he's out there to rectify the wrongs of the world. And so that's their dynamic. And I'll just give you a look, read a couple short pieces here, give a little taste of these characters. Mr. O'Neilan once told me, this is Lee speaking, Mr. O'Neilan once told me in his rolling brogue, not his blogue at all, heed well the deadly, for they hover at her ears. It wasn't the aftermath that was being discussed here, but rather the investigation of a murder. Now I'll level with you. I've never fully understood the clockworks of the O'Neilan brain, but I think what he meant was this. The slain can reveal a good deal by how they lived and how they died. While, as I say, my friend was alluding to the physical realms, a case did fall into our laps near the end of 1956, in which heeding the dead referred not only to facts, but to phantoms. So they go to an event called the Other Worlds Fair, which is kind of a modest version of the World's Fair, but it's all paranormal. Lee is also accompanied by Audrey, who is his perpetual fiancée. They've been about 2.5 years. They've been supposed to get married, and it just hasn't happened. Let's see. So they're taking their seats. You just need to be open-minded, Lee, Audrey said as we settled into our seats. Aren't I always? Do you really want me to answer that? Probably not. Listen, we've all lost loved ones along the way. Your parents, my grandparents, Mr. O'Neilan's wife. It's natural to wonder what becomes of us after death. This crowd isn't just here to wonder. They've come to meet Casper the friendly ghost. Lower your voice, Audrey told me. You'll offend someone. Who? Casper? Look, my sister Claire swears that when she was 10, our grandmother appeared by her bed and stroked her hair. Then the next day, do you know what we found out? That your grandmother had just died? Have I told you this before? That actual event, though it sounds a lot like my Aunt Kathleen, it's based on my sister-in-law who saw her grandmother after she died. They've decided to take on the case, which involves the death of a member of these ghost seekers, and now they're driving off. Oh, I should mention the spectrocator. The spectrocator is a device that's been created to speak with the dead. And seemingly a mishap with the spectrocator, an electrical mishap with the spectrocator, resulted in this death, but there's some big questions about whether this was foul play. So at this point, Lee and Mr. O'Neilan have decided that they're going to go and take on the case and track down some suspects. They're driving along out to do their business. Mr. O'Neilan says, the whole spiritualism aspect does give pause. I snorted. You think some phantom zapped him? I do not, but to paraphrase the bard, there are more things in heaven and earth, Lee, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Please now, don't go flinging your Yeats at me first thing in the morning. Yeats, for the love of God, man, that was Shakespeare. He looked fairly disgusted with me. Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 5, to be precise. I couldn't resist. I don't know Hamlet from a ham and cheese sandwich. And you take pride in that? Not necessarily, but I don't slam myself over it either. I'm just a regular fella. No thrills, no frills. And I haven't logged time on the stage or in the classroom such as some superior types I could mention. This got a chuckle out of him. Superior, am I? You surely wouldn't say that had you seen, for example, the first role that I landed in New York. In that particular instance, I played the part of a ne'er-do-well, enamored, of course, of whiskey, as all Irish stock characters seem to be, who went about life garbed as a giant goldfish. I could barely grasp the concept. A goldfish? You? Was it some kind of farce? It was a tragedy, at least for me. I was hoping for a role crafted by Beckett or perhaps Eugene O'Neill, and instead I drew an inebriated goldfish. You know, I'll never be able to look at you again without imagining scales. So that's a little bit of the repartee between those characters. And with this book, there's a lot of characters many who believe fully in the possibility of life after death, who have claimed to have seen ghosts. There's some characters I think you would say are very much charlatans, are in it to fake people, but there are certainly characters who the reader may feel have legitimate abilities. And that was my intent, is to put it out there, you know, in the midst of figuring out who done it, for the readers to decide what they believe about the tale of the different ghostly instances that are referred to. Did they really happen? Were they in the people's mind? Yeah. So that's the approach to that. I just want to throw open to questions and answers. If anyone has any questions about whether the book or the writing process or ghosts, anything of that nature. Ghosts, someone had? What's your question? Talk more about ghosts. Well, more about ghosts. Let's do Aunt Kathleen again. She said, what was this now? My Aunt Kathleen periodically, well, I'll go back to 93, 4. Aunt Kathleen had a dream where she was up in an airplane, and she was with my grandmother and my grandfather and my mother, and all three of those people had passed away by the time she had this dream. Also in the plane with Kathleen was my Uncle Jim, her brother Jim, who was alive and in New York. So in the dream, she's in this plane, and she has this strong feeling that she should not be on that plane. And she talks people into landing the plane and letting her disembark, even though everyone on the plane is saying, no, stay, Kathleen, stay. But she gets off the plane and goes on her way. And then within 2 weeks or so, or less, she finds out that her brother Jimmy had died. He'd actually been dead a few days before word got out to the family. And in the dream, he was the one person besides herself who was alive on the plane. And as I've said, it's a really large family, so it's not like there's just those 5 people. And you know, it just was very telling that the one live person on the plane besides her was no longer alive within a couple weeks. People have asked, have I seen a ghost? And I haven't. And I would say I'm a probable believer, that I believe that, you know, there are more things in heaven and earth, that it's quite possible. I also wonder if I had allowed myself to be more open to it, perhaps I would have had an experience, but you know, maybe I don't want to. And it's funny because after my mom died, I remember being in Connecticut, like a day or two after she died, and at one point I went to get something out of the car, and I come walking up and I was like, oh man, would Mom appear? And my mom was not a scary person, you know. If she came back as a ghost, she'd probably have a plate of chocolate chip cookies. I mean, that was Mom. And but it was odd because I remember stopping and saying, "Oh boy, I wouldn't want to see Mom. Well, why wouldn't I want to see Mom? You know." But I think there's a lot of deep-rooted Irish superstition in my. And now, when my grandfather died, my son Rustin, who was 5, did you want to say that? Or? We can team tag that story. But he was 5, and a call came that my father had died, and my wife was sitting there with our kids, and Rustin said he looked over and saw Grandpa, like, peeking out from behind. Give me something here. Give me. Come on.
At the time, I think I thought that he was dancing, but I might have just been 5.
Yeah, I know. You'd have to know my dad. I don't think dancing was, you know, it's not like, yeah, oh yeah, Dick Nethercott, dancing. Yeah, makes perfect sense. But you don't know. He might have been pleased to be in his ethereal body. So, you know, and in other parts of the family, there's been tales told too. So it's just a lot that has come in. Any other questions about this spirits or the writing? Yes.
No, Nethercott. What part of Ireland are you from?
I know Nethercott's not an Irish name. Yeah, I know. There might have been an indiscretion with a barmaid or something. I don't know. Well, Nethercott's my father's side, who's Irish, Italian, and some English. My mother's side, there's O'Connors and Allworths. They're from County Kerry. Are you Irish? Are you?
Yeah.
Hey, I didn't mean nothing by that. Where are you people from? Okay. Yeah, Dublin is the other side of the country. Kerry. Yeah. Well, Kerry is the west coast, and certainly Ireland has become very modernized. But if you wanted to go to a section of Ireland that felt closer to what it did 50 or 100 years ago, the west coast of Ireland is probably that place. And County Kerry, it's right on the water. You could see ghosts wandering around there. I mean, it would fit the turf, so to speak. The other queries or statements of fact, or yes?
Did your family ever have evil around the house? I've heard that's something.
No, tell me about that.
Using fairiness and evil.
Hazel?
I have one that I bought from someone in New York City that was a vendor from Ireland.
Oh, really? Huh.
The pressed hazel leaves.
And you're just supposed to tack it somewhere on your wall? Oh, really? No, I haven't. But that reminds me, what I didn't say about the caul with the membrane is that in Ireland, apparently sailors would buy it from the midwives. They would actually buy the remaining flesh, and they would tack it to the masts of their ships to ward off shipwrecks. So that's an odd thing. Yes.
Oh, I'm just curious as to your family's general reaction to the stories, when they were told to you, or it was kind of this is fact, or were they kind of open to interpretation?
Well, I think, as with a lot of family tales in general, not just mine, but anybody's, they become mythology in a way because they get told. It's funny. I've had tales told to me by my mom, and then I told them to an uncle. He told it to an aunt, and then it came back to me, and I realized, oh, the tale they're telling me, they know because I originally told it to someone from my mother. A lot of them came from my mom, and when we were kids, there would be whispers of things. I remember one of my cousins saying, "Oh, there's a dead girl buried under the house," and I realize now that was sort of a twisted interpretation of the thing about the little girl ghost that my grandmother saw. So when my mother presented to me, I think she pretty much presented as this is what she believed, and what I saw my Aunt Kathleen last week, she's telling me these stories, and do I believe them? I think yes, I believe them. But in a way, to me, it doesn't even matter if what is truth or what isn't, because it's all part of this great fabric of tales. And then as a writer, I embrace that and try to. And my daughter's a writer too, and she touches on supernatural themes too. So it's interesting that even though I don't have those experiences myself, I take them on as a writer and make them live again. Yes.
I have a question about your books and your characters. You mentioned Agatha Christie in one of your stories, and from the little bit of dialogue that you read, it seemed like Mr. O'Neill to be kind of like a Poirot.
Yeah, good.
I'm wondering if there's any other specific works or authors that inspired you as a writer.
Well, in terms of mysteries, Agatha Christie was my first sort of adult read. Well, I read the Hardy Boys. For anyone who writes or reads mysteries, the Hardy Boys, if you were a boy, they're definitely the gateway drug to mysteries. If you're a girl, it's Nancy Drew, But just touching on Agatha Christie, I saw a movie version when I was 12 of 10 Little Indians. Then There Were None, and I was just really taken by it. The idea that there's these strangers on an island and someone's picking them off, and one of them must be the killer, or is he? Or And I just thought that was great, and it really, something about it clicked on my psyche. And then someone said, oh, you know, that woman, Agatha Christie, who wrote that story, she's written dozens of stories. So then I really latched onto it. And what I've done here is I have the stories told by Lee, who I guess would be considered the Watson. Because the thing is, Lee's good at taking notes and he's good at telling us the tale, but it's really Mr. O'Neill who figures out. So what I did is I combined two sort of archetypes of detective fiction. One is the private eye. Now usually the private eye is a pretty tough guy. Lee's not that tough a guy. So I combined him with the gentleman amateur, which Perot would be considered. Well, actually, he had been a police officer, but at this point in his career of the stories, he's an amateur in that he's not being paid. He's doing it for love of the mystery. So I was always drawn more to that amateur gentleman character, and that's what I did. In terms of other, you know, when I was a young fella, you know, reading, John Steinbeck was Mice and Men, huh? I mean, that was like the story that kind of gripped me as just like, oh, this is a tale, and that, you know, in some way has guided me on. Yes.
What was the process like getting from, you know, you had all those stories that you heard growing up and then getting that?
Yeah. Well, I should say it's not that I necessarily put those particular stories in the book. It's more that just the sort of the feel of those tales and the atmosphere. You know, once I brought a lot of that in, if not the particular narratives, at least the spirit, for lack of another word of it. But I also did research too. I read about Lilydale. Does anyone know about Lilydale? It's actually up near Buffalo. It's a town that since the 1890s or earlier has been a town full of spiritualists, of people, of mediums, of people who say they see ghosts. And the odd thing is Kathleen lives up there, but she won't go because she feels she'd be too inundated by the energies of the place. And I think you can go up there to this day. It's a little bit like Disney World, that you can buy a day's pass and you get to walk around and you know, for a day's pass you get to go and talk to however many mediums you can get to. So you know, that was another part is actually researching people who believed in spiritualism and such. An interesting thing is one of the fathers of detective fiction, Arthur Conan Doyle, who created Sherlock Holmes, he was an avid believer in spiritualism. And back in those days, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a lot of fake mediums out there who had all these like mechanical devices they were using. I mean, there was a lot of trickery going on. But Arthur Conan Doyle really bought into it. You know, some see him as a pretty gullible character. And the other major figure of that time who was his opposite number in that he tried to debunk it all was Harry Houdini, the magician, which makes sense because, you know, Houdini made his living on creating illusions. So he was very much of the mind of how would someone create an illusion that someone was speaking from the other side. So that's. Thanks. Any last musings or? All right. Well, thank you kindly for coming. Go ahead. Thanks a lot.